Session 1 will focus on US-China relations and implications for Southeast Asia. Moderating this session will be Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Ambassador Ong, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Looks like we are ready for some very good discussion this morning and afternoon. My job this morning is simply to stand between these two presenters and do what I can to make whatever comments they make moderate. China and USA, we have been overwhelmed by what's going on in these two big countries. And today, we have two very eminent speakers. On my right, we have Michael Greene. He is Senior Vice President for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And he is the Japan Chair. The rest of his very illustrious career has been described in your handout, so I will not go very deep into it. Just to say that we look forward to this very experienced gentleman from Washington, D.C. to tell us the U.S. perspective. My other colleague here is Professor Jin Kan-rong. He is Associate Dean of the School of International Studies in Renmin University in China. And if you look at his biodata, he has very extensive experience in various parts of the China-US academic studies. He has a very illustrious career through the various academic institutions in China, and he is very well connected, and therefore, I would say very qualified to comment on the Chinese perspective. Last night over dinner, they asked me whether it should be a good conversation or it should be a confrontational one. Yeah. So according to the general atmosphere out there, it must be a confrontational one, right? I asked for my friends out there to bail me out if the two get into big argument. I will only be a moderator. I am not a peacemaker. Yeah. So, without further ado, I think we should start this morning's proceedings. But just this morning, one of my friends from the business world sent me a WhatsApp message. And his message was very stark. He said that, USA and China, or China and USA, they want to get into a marriage. Maybe they can get into a marriage. But if they do so, if they are in a marriage, this marriage cannot see any divorce. So I think this is quite a provocative statement for me this morning. I have many more things to say about this analysis, that this is a marriage that you cannot get divorced and cannot walk away. But maybe I should leave it to the two speakers to proceed. My idea is that maybe each of them speak for 15 minutes, and then we let you, members of the audience, pose questions. I think we should spend more time for you to comment very briefly and ask pointed questions for the two speakers we have, instead of having this moderator who is not a China expert go on and on. Okay, so shall we start with Michael Greene? Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's a very impressive audience. My friend Jin Kan-rong and I were joking last night which would be more disconcerting for an ASEAN-based audience, if we fought or if we got along too well and formed a G2 right here to determine the future of Southeast Asia between the big powers We won't, I suspect, do either. I'm going to be candid. I was the senior advisor to President George W. Bush on Asia on the NSC staff. We began the Bush administration arguing that with China, the U.S. sought a relationship that was cooperative, comprehensive, and candid. My friends in the Obama administration came in and they changed the last C. They said they sought a relationship that was cooperative, comprehensive, and positive. Over the course of their 8 years, they had a lot more trouble than we did for a variety of reasons. But my view is that candid is probably the right way for the U.S. and China to talk to each other and about each other. I should also say something that should be obvious to most people in this audience, but that is, there is perhaps no bilateral relationship in the world that has the full range of discussions, challenges, also areas of cooperation that the U.S. and China have, from nuclear weapons to enormous economic and educational exchange, to work together in the United Nations Security Council. When you step out of Asia and look at the U.S.-China relationship, it is vast and enormous. At Georgetown University, where I speak, we have scholars working on climate change issues with China, nuclear deterrence, Southeast Asia. It's a very, very complex, to be sure, but very, very broad relationship with many, many areas of dialogue, which I remind friends from third countries who offer sometimes to quote-unquote broker between the U.S. and China, because the scope of our issues is so enormous, it's often hard for people to keep in mind. So I'm in the awkward position of representing the United States at a time when our president is, potentially, what time is it now in Washington? In the next hour or two, he could change our foreign policy, and by the time I'm done, he could tweet and change it again. In my courses at Georgetown, I tell the students to not only focus on structure of international relations, the balance of power and so forth, but to focus on leaders, to focus on agency. I teach a whole course on leaders in Asia, including, of course, Lee Kuan Yew, and tell my students how much leaders, how much agency matters. Recently, I've just been saying structure. It's all about structure. Don't forget about structure. Agency or leadership makes the U.S.-China relationship look a certain way when you contrast Xi Jinping, who came out of the 19th Party Congress looking strong and in command. Of course, he controls his media, he controls his brand. And then Donald Trump, who, by his own leadership style, is presiding over chaotic, disruptive governing style, what some of his critics refer to as a dumpster fire. But these images, I think, can be misleading, and it's important in our discussion to focus also on the structure of international relations, the structure of U.S.-China relations, and the structure of domestic American politics. The basis of American engagement with China, with Asia, and the world, that domestic well of internationalism, is quite robust if you look at public opinion polls, if you look at the views of state governors, members of Congress, enrollment in international programs and universities. Over half of Americans say Asia is the most important region to the world. Well over half of Americans in polls support trade or support the Trans-Pacific Partnership. When asked if we should defend Japan or Korea, our major allies, if they're attacked, 60% or so say yes, among the highest numbers we've ever had. Support for immigration even is at record highs. The structure of domestic American politics, the interests of agricultural exporters, of the Chamber of Commerce, of state governors, is often lost in the focus on agency, on leaders, and on the messages our leaders send. I know that the U.S.-China relationship is of critical importance to the future of Singapore and of ASEAN. I know, as do many American experts, that the last thing countries in this part of the world want is to have to choose between the U.S. and China, that ultimately there's a consensus in ASEAN on the need for a balance. We've done surveys at CSIS of elite opinion in Asia, which indicates a preference, particularly among U.S. democratic allies, as you would expect, for American leadership, and very, very little appetite for either a US-China condominium or a Sino-centric system, and a preference among many smaller states for effective multilateralism. But as the Rolling Stones say, you can't always get what you want. Or as I tell my children, you get what you get and you won't get upset. We're going to have a shifting power dynamic in this region, and it's important that we make sense of it. I am not a believer in the so-called Thucydides trap, the idea advanced by Graham Allison that rising powers inevitably or almost inevitably clash with status quo powers. I think it misses many important factors. But we are in a time of some peril. And I think history suggests strongly that rising powers and status quo powers are much more likely to clash when the smaller and middle-sized states around them are in play. World War I did not begin because Britain, Germany, and France decided to fight one day. It began because of the disintegration of stability in the Balkans. America and Japan didn't fight because of the two leaders waking up and deciding they had to, but because of the collapse of European imperial power in Southeast Asia. It's the periphery around the major powers that often can be the most destabilizing variable when you have these power transitions. And so not only is US-China relationship important for ASEAN, but ASEAN is important to the stability of US-China relations. And I have, in some ways, some deep concerns about ASEAN, and this is a real burden on Singapore as the chair this year, but the ability of Beijing to break the ASEAN consensus in the aftermath of the tribunal's decision on the Philippines case was deeply disturbing in terms of how effective multilateralism in Asia can be and how effective ASEAN can be. ASEAN, I think, has, up to this point, been somewhat effective at imposing a cost on China or a cost on the United States when either is too unilateral, as we were perhaps in the 97-98 financial crisis, or as China was in the South China Sea. It's an open question mark in Washington whether ASEAN can play that function right now, and it's an enormous burden on Singapore. The factors that I think are going to create more entropy, more uncertainty, more friction in US-China relations in the coming year are fairly clear, and I want to briefly go through those. The factors that continue to stabilize US-China relations should also be highlighted, and I want to go through those. The factors that lead many American experts, at least in Washington, to think US-China relations will enter a more difficult year are these. First, it's pretty clear that the American and Chinese articulation of the future of regional order in Asia is diverging. If you just look at what political leaders say. China's vision is of a global multipolarity in terms of the distribution of power, and within Asia, for the near future, some kind of US-China condominium, Xinjin Daguo Guanxi, what Xi Jinping calls the new model of great power relations. This was attractive to some in the Obama administration. It was dropped by the Obama administration, has no support, or virtually no support now, for a variety of reasons, one of which was Xi Jinping's keynote speech at the CICA conference in Shanghai in April 2014, when he used words that Mikhail Gorbachev used in Vladivostok in 1985 to argue there should be no blocs in Asia, meaning no US alliances, and that Asians should determine Asian security. And when he pressured US allies like Korea at the conference to sign on to this statement, which the Koreans didn't do. That struck many in Washington as a zero-sum view of the future of regional order and really killed any enthusiasm among experts for some kind of new model of great power relations, because the great power, the Daguo, forgive my Mandarin accent, I'm a Japanese speaker, the Taikoku, the great power part of that 6-character phrase demotes Japan, demotes India, demotes Australia and Korea, and sets up a power structure, a vision of the US and China as a bipolar relationship in Asia, in a multipolar world. I think the US, increasingly, you can see this in the free and open Indo-Pacific concept the administration advanced recently. The US is more inclined to favor a kind of multipolarity in Asia, where India, Japan, and others are standing forward to maintain a favorable strategic equilibrium. The second factor is, frankly, the declining confidence within the U.S. body politic and among the U.S. public that engagement with China is going to lead to positive changes in China's society and politics. And a number of factors led to this more pessimistic turn in American thinking, which you only have to open the New York Times, recent article in the New Yorker by Evan Osnos, storied China hands like David Shambaugh, Mike Lampton, others who are deeply worried about this. One factor was the South China Sea and what appeared to many Americans, and I think many in this region, as rather blatant coercion. The NGO law in China, the crackdown on civil society, Made in China 2025, and in a much more aggressive effort to force technology transfer when US or European or Japanese companies invest in China, concerns about cyber. All of these have changed the dynamic in the debate. The Chamber of Commerce, the US-China Business Council, all once stalwart advocates for US-China relations, are much more divided now, really quite at a loss for how to frame a vision for US-China relations at a time when the negative news for US businesses is increasing. Third factor, that one's on China. Third factor is on us. Third factor is on the US. President Trump's withdrawal from TPP, his disinterest in a bilateral investment treaty with China, his disdain for multilateral forums, all weakens the American hand in managing China in a peaceful way, in setting rules and finding ways to cooperate that have constituents in China. And the withdrawal from TPP is bad for the American economy, but it frankly weakens our hand with China. Initially, Beijing's reaction to TPP was to criticize it. But over time, economic reformers in Beijing saw advantages to TPP in the same way that Zhu Rongji saw advantages to the WTO accession as an external way to force reforms China needs to keep growing. So it was one of these areas where the US would win by setting rules and expanding markets, and China would win by having an external factor that would drive reform within China, which is in our interests as it is in China's interests. So that one is on us. A fourth factor, which we can go into, is the nature of the military competition. The US Pacific Command and the PLA have planned to fight wars with each other for decades. That's not new. What's new is that the race to dominate cyberspace in a conflict and outer space is shortening the timeline, is making more dangerous the warning time. China, the PLA is developing the ability, has had for some time, to take out satellites, to blind the US with anti-satellite weapons or with cyber. In the South China Sea, submarine activities have a similar kind of effect. The ability to manage a crisis is becoming more difficult because technology is driving competition and shortening the timeline and frankly weakening our understanding of how you manage escalation in these new domains of space and cyber. Fifth factor, growing nationalism, I think particularly in China. And then the last one I mentioned in the brief paper I prepared was the Republic of Korea. I think the US-Korea alliance is in very strong shape, but I worry a little bit that the Moon Jae-in government is sending signals that might tempt China to think that the Republic of Korea is in play geopolitically and might be wooed away from the US alliance system, which I don't think is the case, but it's more the impressions that matter. Now, on the positive side, the US-China economic interdependence is unprecedented. The American public, when you look at opinion polls, although they're more negative about China, rejects containment as an option. When asked, Americans, only about 10% of Americans say containment isn't an option for China. That's true of the elite, it's true of the Congress. I think Xi Jinping retains strong elements of Dengism, of Deng Xiaoping. Xi famously said there are 1,000, I think, reasons why the US and China should not fight. I think confrontation with the US is completely contrary to everything Xi Jinping wants to do. I think the US diplomacy is in a bit of disarray right now because of our presidential election. But ultimately, I think there's more room for cooperation than not in APEC, in the East Asia Summit, in the ASEAN Regional Forum between the US and China. I can tell you as a professor, there are unprecedented levels of academic, grassroots, intellectual exchange between the US and China. And frankly, I think that the balance of power is not shifting as much as some people think because of the strong US economy and because of the strategic trajectories of other major powers like Japan, India, and Australia. And I'll conclude and maybe provoke your questions with four wild cards, four factors that really could cause discontinuity in this US-China relationship. The first is North Korea. There are veterans in the US and veterans in the PLA who fought and killed each other at bayonet point in the Korean War. The amnesty that brought about the ceasefire in 1953, under which we currently live, we are technically in a state of war, has essentially frozen some of the Cold War geopolitics that drove China and the United States to fight, China and the United Nations to fight in that war. When North Korea turns the page to some new chapter, not the one we're talking about now, but collapse, instability, it will thaw, it will unfreeze a lot of those geopolitical tensions that were there in 1950, 51. And if the US and China manage this well, it will establish a pattern of trust and cooperation, together denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, that will set US-China relations on a much better trajectory. But if we fall into a zero-sum competitive approach to instability in the Korean Peninsula, that in turn, like the Korean War, will set the trajectory for US-China relations for the future. Korea is critical. Right now it's a mix of cooperation and intense competition. Economic crises in either the US or China, and China faces some significant non-performing loans, debt problems, questions about economic growth. Economic instability in either could undermine the basis for economic and political cooperation we have. That's a historical pattern we've seen before. A trade war offers some risk. I think the US is likely to move ahead with unilateral sanctions under the Omnibus Trade Law, Section 201, Section 301. China's probably going to retaliate. Will that lead to a ceasefire as each side has demonstrated its frustration, or will it get out of control? Probably it will not get out of control, but you never know with these things. And finally, things we can't anticipate: terrorist attacks, enormous transnational disasters like the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004 or 5. These enormous non-traditional threats or non-state threats, it could drive the US and China closer together. I was in the White House during SARS and the avian influenza, and the US and China were able to work very well together in the midst of that crisis, with very little time for bureaucratic sort of maneuvering. The President Bush, President Hu, at the time said, we need to work on this, and the governments did. So these kinds of shocks to Asia from terrorism, natural disasters, could also generate the kind of cooperation that probably the region wants to see between the US and China, but frankly could also go the other way. So I've ended with uncertainties and question marks and the hope that maybe I'll provoke some questions from the audience, Ambassador Wong, and I look forward to my colleagues' comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Professor Jing, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's an honor for me to be here. I should start by this number. In China, we have a Hong Kong-based Phoenix TV, and the website affiliated with that TV, Phoenix TV website, they count how many times Mr. Donald Trump criticized China during the campaign days, right? And the total number is 235 times. Much more than we expected, right? So because of this fact, he criticized China in a very, how to say, hostile way. So many people in China are concerned about the US-China relations during his administration. But as soon as he got into the White House, China devoted a lot to establish ties with his team. And I think China very successful to have good tie with his daughter, his son-in-law, and other members in his team. And in early April last year, right, our President Xi Jinping fly to Mar-a-Lago and have 7 hours talk with President Trump. And both leaders decided to continue the strategic dialogue between China and the US. And then we have 4 high-level dialogue referring to security, economic, cyber, social and cultural exchanges. So, and 2 months ago, when President Trump visited Beijing, we gave him a so-called State Visit Plus treatment. And we gave him a huge package of gifts, over 250 billion US dollars, right? So because of this effort, I think in the past year, US-China relations is under control. Although we have some differences, we have some public dispute, but generally speaking, the relationship is quite stable. But looking in the future, there will be more problem in US-China relations. In the latest National Security Strategy report, the US defined China as a revisionist country. It used to be just scholars, they use this term, but the official document very restrained for. They are very cautious not to use this term, right? Revisionist country. But this time, the US side defined China just like Russia as a revisionist country. And if you look into the details, what it means revisionist, one is economic aggression. And from long-term viewpoint, the US consider the success of China is a challenge to the way of life of America, to the basic value of America, to the system arrangement of America. So this definition will be a long-lasting impact for the future of US-China relations. And another step came out relating with the so-called National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. In the section 1259, the US Congress, they made 7 suggestions relating with China. From Chinese perspective, all those suggestions are quite provocative. Is one suggestion in particular, the Congress suggests the US Navy ships to shift to Taiwan. Right? That will make the situation, cross-strait situation, in danger. So that's the situation relating with China-US relations now and in the near future. But looking into the long-term US-China relations, there are 3 concerns in my mind. One is that the United States is quite divided now. I noticed last year Time magazine, after Donald Trump became president, the Time magazine described him as the president of a divided states of America, right? So that's our problem, how to deal with a very split United States. Whether President Donald Trump really represents the United States, right? How is his limit of power? So that's a new challenge. Actually, that's a challenge for all the other parts of the world, not only for China. I noticed our European friends, our friends in ASEAN, they're also very confused, right? How to deal with this divided United States. Whether the promise of US administration is reliable or not. People are not sure. Not that sure as before, right? And another change is on Chinese side. Definitely China become much more confident than before. right? Including China's way to deal with the United States. Based on this fact, by the end of last year, according to currency value, China's GDP close to the 70% of the United States. But if you use another indicator, PPP, purchasing power parity, China's GDP last year should be 15% larger than the United States. And more important is that China's manufacturing GDP last year is 170% of the United States, the largest one in human history, right? So based on this fact, China become much more confident than before. Then comes the problem whether China's confidence is overconfidence. That's the problem. We don't know. And the third new change in the coming years is that now US, Japan, India, Australia, all those countries are very interested in this concept, Indo-Pacific Strategy. I noticed that some economists, they use this term, Indo-Pacific, in 1960s. They use this term just to try to encourage more economic cooperation between these two regions. But from political or geopolitical perspective, the scholars use this term trace back to just 10 years ago. In 2007, Indian scholar, they initiated this concept. Then followed by Australia, right? But at that time, the Indian government rejected this idea, right? So not very popular. The policy influence is very limited. But now the story is different. Donald Trump administration very interested in this topic concept, and they got a very positive response from Prime Minister Modi. So this concept, Indo-Pacific concept, becomes significant. And under this concept, the so-called four-state alliances become real, right? Including US, Australia, Japan, and India, right? So that will make the situation more complicated than before, That will make the third party become more important, right? US-China relations get back to the normal in 1972 because of the third-party threat, Soviet Union. But after the end of Cold War, the US-China relations gradually, based on bilateral relations, the role of third party gradually declined. But now the third party become more important again. That will make the bilateral relations more complicated than before. Now I'd like to conclude my remark in this way. In this year, 2018, we'll see more trade dispute between China and the United States, partly relating with the midterm election of the United States. Right? Donald Trump, I think in his mind, he must win the midterm election. Or if he lose the control of the House and the Senate, he will be really in difficult in his remaining 2 years, right? So he must win the midterm election, and in order to make GOP to win the election, he must play trade war card with China. So there will be more trade friction between China and US in this year. But I still believe we can put those trade disputes under control. And another prediction is that I tend to believe US-China will have a significant cooperation on North Korean issue because we do share a lot of commonalities on this issue. I hope, but I and I also believe there will be significant cooperation on this issue, North Korean issue, between China and the United States in this year. But finally, I have to say my real concern on Taiwan, mainly on Taiwan. As you all know, now the relationship between Beijing and Taipei is really bad. Right? The cross-Taiwan Strait relations is in really low ebb. So under this background, if U.S. do something very provocative from Beijing's perspective, Beijing will fight him back. Then Taiwan issue will become a real big issue, affect U.S.-China relations. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jing. Okay. So far, you have heard the two speakers, but I can say that they have not told you anything new, right? So you can now ask them any questions, any points you want them to clarify, and hopefully we can open their secret box in their mind to tell you something that you have not heard before or you have not read in the media. Anybody who want to take a shot at it? We have 20 minutes. Oh, Tomiko, yes. Microphone, please. Must give him microphone. You cannot ask him to walk there. Tommy, please.
Thank you. Very happy to see my old friends Mike Greene and Jin Chanrong here. Mike, I have two questions for you. President Trump seems to believe that China has the capacity to pressure North Korea to give up its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. And he seems to be depending on China to deliver North Korea. If China is unable or unwilling to do so, will he then turn against China and assume a posture towards China which is consistent with his election campaign rhetoric, which is China the enemy? So that's my first question. My second question is about this new concept of an open and free Indo-Pacific. Could you explain to us what is the strategic significance of this concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific? And is it intended to replace Asia-Pacific? And where does ASEAN feature in this new concept of Indo-Pacific? Related to this, I noticed that the Quad, consisting of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, has been revived. So is the Quad intended to be the nucleus of the Indo-Pacific? If so, don't you think the Chinese will view this as an anti-China coalition? As for Professor Jin Chanrong, I want to ask you a question which is in the mind of most of my colleagues and me in ASEAN. Ever since Deng Xiaoping came to power, and during the administration of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, China has pursued a foreign policy of good neighborliness towards your neighbors, of keeping a low profile internationally. And we noticed that that era has come to an end. We are now entering a new era, the era of Xi Jinping. Can you explain to us what is President Xi Jinping's foreign policy? And what is China's new attitude towards your neighbors?
Thank you, Professor Tomiko. I think there are about 10 questions in there. I think all of you have asked Tommy to ask all the important questions first, all right? So maybe we let Professor Jing, you take the floor first to answer Tomiko. And over to you.
You know, in China, among Chinese scholars, we have different opinion on what's the real meaning of new ages. Some people believe our current leader gave up Deng Xiaoping's low-key strategy already, like my colleague in Tsinghua University, Yan Xuetong. But more people believe our leader partly inherited low-key strategy, like Qin Yaqin from 外交学院. I think I agree with Qin Yaqin. We have some change, but we also, the current leader, he changed something, but he still inherited something. During the, in 19大报告, in the 19th Party Congress report, Xi Jinping stressed on this fact. China well, still in the early stage of socialism, 社会主义初级阶段. In quite a long time, China will still stay at this stage, the early stage of socialism. And he also stressed another fact: China is still the biggest developing country in the world, right? And I think, and he still promised China will loyal to Deng Xiaoping's strategy, 和平发展, peaceful development. I think keep low-key strategy partly remained, but he does change something. One change is that our current leader's definition of China is a world power, not a regional power. You know, used to be we always define ourselves as a regional power, but now the new definition is a world power. Since he raised this concept, 中国特色大国外交, a big power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. So now the definition is a world power. That's one thing. Second, he changed the style of Chinese diplomacy, right? Used to be we are a typical reactive approach diplomacy. Always wait our American friends to take lead, to initiate something. But now China's style changed from reactive to proactive, right? But unfortunately, our US friend defined our new style as assertiveness, right? Even aggressiveness. We use the term proactivism. And in practice, that means China will take lead, initiate something. Actually, China initiated so many new ideas, right? That confused many people outside China, within China. It's difficult for us, for Chinese scholars to catch up the meaning of a new concept. But more important is that since Xi Jinping came into power, we have some new practice. It used to be China's foreign policy just focused on 4 parts. One is to deal with big powers, to deal with the neighborhood and a developing country, then international organization, right? 4 parts. But now we have 4 new practice. One is 一带一路, One Belt, One Road initiative. Another is to protect the overseas national interests of China. The third is soft power, to speak Chinese story to outside world. And the fourth one is very important. China now try to take lead in global governance. Right? Used to be China very passive in global governance, but now China very active in global governance. So 4 old ones, 4 new ones, that's something new. And as for China's attitude towards our neighborhood, I think the spirit is still try to have a good neighborhood. But the approach to deal with good neighborhood changed. Used to be China tried to have a so-called same distance diplomacy. China tried to show smiling face to everybody, right? Try to please everybody. But now I think China's approach become more more complicated. We accept different distance with different neighborhood, right? And there used to be just the carrots, but now sometimes China will play sticks. So that's something changed. Whether it's good for China or not, we don't know, because it is a new policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael?
So on North Korea, China provides about 90% of North Korea's food and fuel. And in a material sense, if Beijing wanted to pull the plug, it could. But as we all know very well, the Chinese leadership doesn't want to face the consequences of that. Donald Trump came into office thinking that as the author of The Art of the Deal and the smartest president in history, that he could do what no predecessor had done and strike a deal with China by putting everything on the table. Very, famously transactional, including trade issues, even Taiwan. People in Taipei were extremely nervous about this. People in Tokyo were nervous. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, set up a channel to the Chinese leadership to try to come up with some kind of grand bargain along these lines. Couldn't be done. The Chinese leadership was not capable of doing that. The internal debate about China, about North Korea and China, we only see a little bit of, but I think it's quite intense, and there are quite bitter divisions and quite a bit of frustration with everyone, with the US, with Japan, with South Korea, but especially with Kim Jong-un. So I think Donald Trump came away frustrated, but I don't think to the point where he will deliberately, pick a trade war or confront China because of that. His tweet was revealing when he said he's disappointed in China. They tried, they just couldn't do it. I thought that was a very revealing. We know so much about what our president thinks now compared to the past because these tweets are there's no bureaucrats involved in them. They come out right from the president. So I thought it was quite revealing when he expressed disappointment rather than anger that China couldn't step up to deal with North Korea. I think that the administration as a whole is positioned to put a lot of pressure on North Korea through these sanctions, not just the UN sanctions, but the US Treasury Department sanctions, which are quite robust and which allow the Treasury Department to target Chinese banks that are assisting North Korea. And there's no doubt that there are Chinese corporations, not with the government's blessing, but there are Chinese corporations helping North Korea. The new Hwasong 15 road mobile solid fuels missile was on a 9-chassis TEL, a carrier that was the first few were imported from China against sanctions. So, and you could see them in parades and things, it's no secret. So there will be more pressure in the form of possible sanctions against Chinese companies. I think there's support for that in the Congress, and I know in the administration, and then missile defense and other measures with Japan and Korea will pick up. So there will be more tension over the North Korea issue, but on the other hand, Kim Jong-un is driving the US and China to work together. We have to work together in the Security Council. On the free and open Indo-Pacific, this, as a former bureaucrat, I can tell you honestly, this came together because they needed a theme for the president's trip to Asia, and they didn't have one. So the NSC and policy planning scratched their head. They read my book. I have to plug my book, A History of American Strategy, called By More Than Providence. Makes an excellent Chinese New Year's gift. And they came up with this free and open Indo-Pacific idea as a response to Belt and Road, as a thematic response to the Sika speech of Xi Jinping in April 2014, which was really seen, I think rightly, as an attack on the US alliance system in Asia, and in response to the militarization of the South China Sea and the establishment of a major Chinese military base in Djibouti and various places in the so-called String of Pearls and the much more aggressive Chinese position in Deccan and the Himalayas. So the free and open Indo-Pacific concept was ripe. The actual phrase free and open Indo-Pacific was taken right out of a Japanese government policy planning document. And so it's a Japanese idea, but if you go a little further back, it's an American idea. It's an Alfred Thayer Mahan maritime strategy concept. When I was in the White House, we responded to the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004 by calling the Indian, Japanese, and Australian governments and proposing that the four of us form a task force with our primarily naval forces to respond, especially in Banda Aceh, to the tsunami. In less than 12 hours, we were able to get these four governments that had never done this before together to deploy. Singapore came in later, and New Zealand and the UN and so forth. It happened in part because it was during Christmas break and most of the US government was gone, so we were incredibly efficient. But it also happened because what it demonstrated was that these countries have a common stake and willingness to step forward. And there was interest in reviving the Quad in various ways, and Prime Minister Abe made it a campaign promise, but it was a little too rich. Looked too much like a bloc against China. What's interesting now is that this Quad has reformed as part of the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, and the Indians and the Japanese and the Australians had no hesitation, which shows you their reaction to China's behavior. The flaws in it are basically twofold. One is Korea. You know, how does Korea fit? The South Koreans never liked the Quad, and that's a problem. The other problem is how can you have a free and open Indo-Pacific without a concept of a free and open trading architecture like TPP? But the good news, I think, is that this administration in Washington is very heavy on military men. Lots of generals and colonels and majors. And when they put together a plan, they execute it. So they've come back from the trip, and they're now having meetings with allies, think tanks, the Congress, on how to put more meat on the bone of this free and open Indo-Pacific. And that's good for a country like Singapore or any US friend and ally because 80 or 90% of it is still to be defined. And it's an opportunity for friends, for allies, for Congress to say, well, you know, if you want a free and open Indo-Pacific, you'd better start coming up with a trade strategy, and you better start thinking about ASEAN. So how does ASEAN fit? I think ASEAN should tell the administration how ASEAN fits. It's an opportunity to start shaping a concept that I think they're going to stick to, but has a lot of blank spaces.
Thank you. Thank you, Tommy, for those series of good questions. Next comments or questions? Yes, over there. Introduce yourself. I can't see you very clearly.
Morning. My name is Mano Sabnani. Two questions for the panel. One is that in terms of winning friends and influencing people in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, it looks like China is using more of the carrot approach with the Belt and Road Initiative, making more friends, getting closer to Philippines, closer to Malaysia and so on. In the case of US, a big stick towards North Korea, but other than that, not many friendly overtures to individual ASEAN countries. So could you comment on the different strategies and long-term consequences in terms of relationships with ASEAN countries, between US, China, and ASEAN countries? My second question is on Singapore itself. In the past, in a small way, I mean, Singapore played that role of trying to soothe out any issues between the two powers, US and China, being located in the right place and with friendship on both sides. But going forward, does Singapore still have a role on that side, given that the relationship itself is evolving between the two powers? And what do you think about bilateral relations between Singapore-US and Singapore-China? How are they going to go forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Professor Jin, you tackle the part about China.
China determined to play a more active role in the coming years. So that's a fact. And this role largely related with economic side. But I think in the mind of our leader, he also paid more and more attention to so-called soft power side. Definitely China want to have a good image among ASEAN countries. And this effort first relate with economic side. As this gentleman said, we will try to do more with ASEAN countries on Belt and Road Initiative. But I think China will also increase, cultural exchange, something like that. And to exchange the experience of, political governance, social governance, etc. But generally speaking, China is at its early stage to exert power in outside the world. Before 18th Party Congress, before Xi Jinping came into power, China is actually a very inward-looking country. So China just changed its style. So at the early stage. So whether China can how to say, be welcomed by the neighborhood, it's too early to say. Perhaps 10 years later, then we can make some judgment whether China can have a good remark. 10 years later, we can get some conclusion. As for China-Singapore relations, definitely China treats Singapore in some special way. And one particular reason is that I think China, the elites of China still very appreciate the Singapore model. And I personally believe now China is just on that track. China is just on the track to become a very large Singapore. 10 years later, the world in outside China and the people within China have to deal with a very big Singapore, very large Singapore. But whether we can practice as good as Singapore, we don't know, because the size is too different, right? And the external relations is quite different. We don't know whether we use the same model, but we are not very sure whether we can have the same success. But one thing is very sure, we are on that track already, right? And we have other reasons to have good tie with Singapore, but this one is very special. I think the elites in China, including our leader, appreciate this model, and we'll try to follow that model. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Kang Rong, I want to ask you, since I used to work in ASEAN, does China see the role of ASEAN in regional geopolitics? ASEAN's role as a group of small countries is usually to bring people from outside the region, the big countries, together, and to work with regional big countries. Yeah. So what we have seen in the past few years is a bit of, in my opinion, quick and overreaction from China with regard to what ASEAN has been trying to do in the traditional way. And in the process, in various actions in the past 2-3 years, it come across like China is not quite comfortable with what ASEAN is doing. ASEAN centrality is defined in different ways, yeah, but overall, the usefulness or the value of ASEAN is that it brings all the big guys together in the region and do it in a manner that is peaceful and relatively stable, and we try our best to take care of all the perceived big interests of the countries. So how does China see ASEAN's role going forward in this coming year or two?
I think the official language still put ASEAN in the center. That's a fact. If you read our official document, we still regard ASEAN very high. But I think in the practice, definitely China give more attention to the relationship with the member countries. I think that's a fact. And especially to those so-called middle power countries like Vietnam, Indonesia. I think in the coming 10 years, there will be very important new phenomenon, that is the rising of middle power. Because, you know, now United States withdraw their influence to some extent, partly because of Donald Trump. Right? He withdrew from many, area. The U.S. should dominate, but he just don't want to spend the money there. So because the withdrawal of the United States and because China not get ready, so that means there will be more and more space be considered the vacuum of power. Then that means the middle power countries will be more important in the coming years, including this area. In Middle East, there will be more prominent role of Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, right? In our region, I think Vietnam, Indonesia will be very important in the coming years, right? So that's something I think is the fact. The official attitude not be changed, but in practice, we pay more attention to member countries, just like China's way to deal with Europe. We still regard EU very high, but actually China pay more attention to member countries. So that's why our European colleague complained we have special tie with Germany, and we have so-called 16 plus 1, right? That raised some protest from European side. The same logic happened here.
Well, the next few days you can see a lot of things about France and China. No? The French president is on the way there, right? Okay, Michael?
So the U.S. has an interest in ASEAN centrality, no doubt about it. And U.S. diplomacy and economic statecraft from Bush through Obama has been focused on that. Right now, this approach is in, I would say, temporary pause. One reason is that the assumptions about what could be done with ASEAN centrality were shaken by the way Beijing was able to break ASEAN consensus in the wake of the tribunal decision in July 2 years ago. If you're the U.S. or Japan or Australia or another country that looks at ASEAN centrality as a way to impose some disciplines on China, that was a rather disheartening outcome. So that's one reason why this U.S. strategy towards ASEAN is in a bit of a uncertain phase. And the second reason is that we just had elected a president who's all about disrupting the deep state, as he calls it. And the most disrupted part, unfortunately, has been the State Department. And as many diplomats in the room will know, Southeast Asia policy is largely managed at the assistant secretary level, sometimes deputy secretary, people like Kurt Campbell in the Obama administration, Bob Zoellick in the Bush administration. A lot of those people are not in place. So that's the other reason why there's some lesser engagement, frankly, on ASEAN. Part of it is endemic to ASEAN's challenges. Part of it is our own political disruption right now, which I think is temporary. Ultimately, I think the administration will return to much deeper engagement. And you can see that in two areas. One is Secretary of Defense Mattis has been out to this region twice as much as any of his predecessors in their first years. DOD, the Defense Department, is staffed up. Pacific Command's exercises with countries in this region are ramping up steadily. And the president himself spent 12 days out here, which frankly surprised a lot of people, including his own staff, who were worried after about day 5 he'd get cranky and grumpy and say, I'm never going to Asia again. But he enjoyed it, and he stayed for 12 days. And that's longer than any president has been to this region in 3 decades. So we're in a dip now, but there are some compelling reasons why I think the U.S. is going to have to engage. What will hurt us in the medium to long term is TPP. Because without that trade agenda, the State Department diplomatic agenda and the Defense Department agenda, that's 2 pillars in what should be 2 legs in what should be a leg stool, and the trade piece is going to hurt us, that's no doubt. Singapore, I mean, the Strategic Framework Agreement, which I worked on in the administration, the Free Trade Agreement, which I also worked on, are very robust, as you know. When I was in the White House, there was only one former world leader who could go in to see the President of the United States if he wanted, and that was Lee Kuan Yew, because he was Lee Kuan Yew, because of the history and strategic vision he brought. And Singapore enjoys that in the United States in a unique way. So I think U.S.-Singapore ties are pretty strong. The U.S. is not in a position to ask or expect or want countries to choose, and it would be a huge mistake. And I don't think in this free and open Indo-Pacific you've heard anyone in the administration say you have to choose us or China. You sometimes hear that from Beijing. You sometimes hear that from Beijing in this region, and I think the administration is smart not to go there, to make it clear that we don't win when relations between China and countries in this region suffer.
Thank you. I am told that time is up, but I saw one hand there, one lady. Maybe we should at least give her a chance. Yes, please. Quick one, and then we get a quick answer, and then we can go for our coffee break. Go ahead, yeah.
Hi, good morning. Okay, hi, good morning. My name is Ting Ting. I'm from Phoenix Satellite TV. Thank you for both professors for very insightful comments. I have one quick question. My question is, both countries seem to maintain a front supporting multipolarity, but at times express a need to protect self-interest. So in your opinion, how would the two countries continue this delicate balance to the New World Order? Thank you.
Let me ask you to reframe the question again. Slowly, because the feedback here, the sound is not very good for us on stage.
Sure, no problem. Both countries seem to maintain a front supporting multipolarity, but at times express a need to protect self-interest. In your opinion, how would the two countries continue this delicate balancing act in the New World Order?
Goh Chok Tong used to say, just be promiscuous. He called it virtuous promiscuity. Yeah. But I think I will ask Professor Jin to say a few words on this quickly, and then Michael, you can wrap up, and then we can go for a coffee break. Just 1 minute, please. Yeah.
Okay. I think China do hope to be a partner of the United States, but we are very realistic. We cannot be a full partner of the United States. We want to be a limited partner of the United States, and we should have issue by issue cooperation, and then we have some useful dialogue to put the difference under control. So on U.S. side, we want to be a limited partner, and at the region, we want to have a mechanism that let the multilateral arrangement works, and also let all the big powers play some role at the same time. Thank you.
Go.
So the new model of great power relations proposed by Xi Jinping is positive in the sense that it's trying to avoid confrontation between the US and China, but it's negative and very revealing because, as I said, the great powers are China, Russia, the United States, and sometimes the EU. The Xi Jinping version of the new model of great power relations does not include Japan or India or Korea. From a US perspective, that's a formula that weakens American interests and influence in the region. And the US clearly for some time has wanted India and Japan and these other middle and major powers to be influential in this region. In the case of India, even if they're not a US ally, because there's confidence in Washington that these countries want an open regional architecture, do not, and are going to guard against coercion by China. It was surprising, as the professor says, that the administration in the National Security Strategy said China is a revisionist power, which is, academics say that, but for the US government to say that was a bit jarring. But the historical record is that rising powers tend to be revisionist. Usually they're revisionist in their own neighborhood, and then they free ride on the global power. And the United States proudly carried this tradition. When we, through the Monroe Doctrine and the Mexican-American War and all sorts of other violence, were revisionist in the Western Hemisphere to assert our, for defensive reasons and ambition, to assert our dominance. It's what Japan did in Asia when it rose. It's what Bismarck did in Europe. But all of us free rode on British power globally. And in a way, although the 21st century is very different in terms of interdependence and globalization, in a way, that's probably a good description of China right now. I think there are quite striking revisionist strategies in Asia, and I think Xi Jinping himself has articulated them. But on a global basis, I don't think that there's any ambition in Beijing to try to lead or replace the US. So that's the mix we're in. So how would we stabilize that relationship? I think the US needs to find ways, short of containment, to discourage Beijing from thinking that revisionism through coercion will work. If it's money, fair enough. If Belt and Road is about money, fair enough. If it involves coercion, that's not going to be acceptable to many, many countries, including not only the US, but other countries like Japan and Australia. And then globally, there are many issues we do have to work on. So how do we stabilize that? I think we need to maximize the areas where we cooperate. It's unfortunate that the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement. I'm a bit of a skeptic on what the Paris Agreement might actually have achieved, but the one historic thing to me about the Paris Climate Agreement was that it was largely built around a US-China consensus. And these kinds of global challenges are where the US and China can build confidence, even as we deal with the dangerous and scratchy issues in the region. The other thing we have to do, and frankly the US and China have lost this, is we don't have a good strategic dialogue. In the Bush administration, Bob Zoellick, when he was Deputy Secretary of State, had a dialogue I was in with Dai Bingguo, the executive foreign minister and then States Counsel in China, and it was candid. It was 2 or 3 days with only a handful of people, Lee Kuan Yew style, talking about geopolitics, talking candidly. Hillary Clinton continued that with Dai Bingguo, and then we lost it. Part of the reason is that within the Chinese system, it's not clear who speaks for Xi Jinping. And part of it is in the US system, it's not clear who speaks for Donald Trump. If we can fix that in the US or China, it will go a long way towards the kind of stabilizing that the question is referencing.
Well, thank you, Michael and Kan Rong. I have to bring this to a close since we have to go on for the next session and you need to have a coffee break. So back to you, Ha.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong and distinguished speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I would now like to invite you for a coffee break at the foyer. Session 2 will start promptly at 10:30 a.m.